Section number 33 of the Mary Frances Story Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. The Mary Frances Storybook by Jane Eayre FRYER. Robert of Sicily. There is an old legend of a proud king named Robert of Sicily. This legend tells of the greatest event of Robert's life, and the poet, Longfellow, has written a beautiful poem about it, which everyone should read. This is the story. Robert, King of Sicily, was a very proud monarch, and a very selfish one. He spent most of his time enjoying himself, and gave little heed to the wants of his people. On St. John's Eve he attended vesper service with a great retinue of knights and lords and pages. He was dressed most magnificently, and proudly sat while the choir chanted some strange Latin words. The king did not understand Latin, and turned to a learned clerk near by. He said, "What do those words mean?" The clerk answered, "They mean, He has put down the mighty from their seat, and has exalted them of low degree." The king laughed scornfully, and said, "It is well that such words are sung in Latin, for there is no power on earth that can push me from my throne." Then he leaned back yawning, and fell asleep. When he awoke it was already night. The church was empty, and all in darkness. The king was angry at finding himself alone. He groped his way toward the great doors, but found them locked. He thought of the windows, but they were high above his reach. Then he became frightened, and cried aloud. He listened, but all that he heard was the resounding echoes of his cries, as they rang, again and again, through the high vaulted ceiling of the church. He knocked with his fists against the doors, and swore awful oaths against every one in his court. He became so angry that he tore his magnificent robes into shreds. He had long since lost his hat and cloak. At length the sexton of the church heard the noise, and he thought that perhaps thieves were breaking into the church. So he lit his lantern and went to the door. When he could make himself heard, he asked, "Who is there?" The king, half choked with rage, answered fiercely, "Open, 'tis I, the king. Are you afraid?" The frightened sexton muttered to himself, "It is some drunken beggar, or someone crazy," and turning the great key, he flung open the doors. A man in torn garments, without hat or cloak, rushed past him. He neither looked at him nor spoke, but vanished almost like a spectre from his sight. Bareheaded, breathless, covered with dust and cobwebs, Robert strode on through the darkness and came to the palace gates. He rushed through the courtyard, thrusting aside the guards and pages, and hurried up the broad stairs. From hall to hall he passed in breathless speed, although he heard voices and cries to stop him, until he came to the banquet room, which was blazing with light. There he stood motionless, speechless, amazed, for on the throne there sat another king, wearing his crown, his robes, and even his signet ring. He looked at first glance exactly like King Robert. He was of the same height and the same form and features, but there was a gracious beauty about him which Robert lacked. King Robert stood there, gazing at him in anger and rage when he looked up. With a glance of surprise and pity he asked, "Who are you?" Robert answered, "I am the king, and I have come to take my place. You are an impostor who pretends to be king." At these words the angry guest sprang up with drawn swords. But the man on the throne said, "No, not the king, but the king's jester. You shall from now on wear the bells and scallop cape of the court jester, and make fun for us all. Your companion shall be an ape." Then he turned away toward his guests. Some of the servants came forward to take Robert away, and they were quite deaf to his ravings and angry threats. With shouts of laughter they pushed him on before them down the stairs, and mockingly bowed before him, and pretended to honor him, all the while laughing and tittering and making fun of him. They left him in a room in the stable where at length, exhausted, he fell asleep. The next morning, waking with the first day's light, he thought to himself, "I've had an ugly dream." But the straw rustled when he turned his head, and there were the jester's cap and bells lying near. He heard the horses clapping in their stalls, and on looking around the room saw the poor ape. So he remembered. It was no dream. His happy life, he thought, could not be changed, had vanished from him. The days came and went. Under the rule of the new king, the island prospered as never before. Robert continued to be the jester, laughed at and scorned. His only friend was the ape, his only food, what others left. Sometimes the other king would meet him and ask, "Are you still the king?" And always Robert would throw back his head and fling the answer haughtily, "I am the king." Robert had two brothers. One was Valmond, Emperor of Almaine. The other was Pope Urbain. One day, almost 3 years after the wild night that Robert had been locked in the church, ambassadors came from Valmond, Emperor of Almaine, bringing letters. The letters asked King Robert to join his brother Valmond in a visit to their brother at Rome. The ambassadors were received with great pleasure, and were presented with many beautiful gifts of robes and jewels. Then the king, who was not King Robert, went with them across the sea to Italy. He was accompanied by a great retinue of knights, all dressed in uniform, wearing gay plumes in their helmets. They rode horses with jeweled bridles, and even wore golden spurs. They were followed by pages and servants, and toward the very last, Robert, the jester, rode on a piebald pony, and behind was perched the ape. Through every town they went, they made much fun for the people, who followed along after, laughing and poking fun at them. The company were received with great pomp and ceremony, and the three brothers seemed delighted at being together again. Suddenly Robert burst through the crowd, and running up to them cried, "I am the king! Do you not know me? Look at me! I am your brother, Robert of Sicily. This man is but an impostor. He is not the king." The emperor and the pope looked at the angry, worried jester for a long moment. Then the emperor laughed and said, "What strange sport to keep a crazy fellow for a jester!" And the poor baffled jester was hustled back into the crowd. Then came Easter Sunday, and the beauty and the solemnity of Easter services touched the hearts of all men. Robert was deeply moved. For the first time in life he saw what kind of man he had been. He saw how selfish and proud and haughty he had been. He wished with all his soul that he had been a better man, and he made up his mind that, no matter what happened, he would never be so selfish and mean again. Now the visit ended. The grand visitors left Rome and journeyed homeward, and when they were once more established, the king on the throne sent for Robert. He motioned everyone else out of the room and beckoned Robert to draw near. And when they were alone, he asked, "Art thou the king?" Robert bowed his head, and folding his arms, said, "You know best. I only know that I have sinned, and have been proud and selfish. Let me go from here and try to make up in some way for the wrong which I have done." And just as he finished saying this, there rose through the windows loud and clear words of the chant. "He has put down the mighty from their seat, and has exalted them of low degree." Then the man who was with Robert cried joyously, "I am not the king, I am an angel. You are the king." When King Robert raised his eyes, lo, he was alone, but all dressed in his magnificent apparel as of old. And when his courtiers came, they found him kneeling upon the floor in silent prayer. "Robert was fortunate," said the Story King, "in learning his lesson before it was too late." "Yes, indeed he was," answered the Story Lady. "The fourth story is of a young man who repented when it was too late." End of section 33. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Section 34 of the Mary Frances Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. The Mary Frances Storybook by Jane Eyre FRYER. The Man Without a Country. Once there was a man, a young officer in the United States Army, who did a dreadful thing. He cursed his native country. He pretended for a while that he did not care when he was punished, but in the end he was very, very sorry. Because he wore his uniform without the official buttons, the sailors on the ships on which he was imprisoned called him Plain Buttons. His name was Philip Nolan. Lieutenant Nolan was as fine a young officer as there was in the Legion of the West, as the Western Division of the United States Army was called in those early days, 100 years ago. At the time, the Mississippi Valley was the Far West to most people, and seemed a very distant land indeed. There were a number of forts along the river, and Nolan was stationed in one of these. Nolan's idol was the brilliant and dashing Aaron Burr, who visited the fort several times between 1805 and 1807. He walked and talked with Nolan and obtained a very strong influence over him. He got Nolan to take him out in his skiff and show him something of the great river and the plans for the new post. And by the time Burr's visit was over, Nolan was enlisted body and soul in Burr's disloyal schemes. From then on, though he did not yet know it, Nolan lived as a man without a country. Burr soon got into trouble with the government, and some of his friends were tried for treason, Nolan among them. It became very plain during the trial that Nolan would do anything Burr told him, that he would obey Burr far quicker than his country, in spite of his oath as an officer of the army. So when Colonel Morgan, who was president of the court, asked Nolan, at the close of the trial, whether he wished to say anything to show that he had always been faithful to the United States, he cried out in a fit of frenzy, "Curse the United States! I wish I may never hear of the United States again." Probably he did not realize how the words would shock old Colonel Morgan and the other members of the court. Half the officers who sat with him had served through the Revolutionary War, and had risked their lives, not to say their necks, cheerfully and loyally for the country which Nolan so lightly cursed in his madness. It may be said for Nolan that he had grown up in the West of those days, then an almost unknown country. He had been educated on a plantation, where the most welcome guests were Spanish officers and French merchants from Orleans, who, to say the least, were unfriendly to the United States. He had spent half his youth with an older brother, hunting horses in Texas, which was not then a part of the United States. In a word, the United States meant almost nothing to him. Yet there was little excuse for Nolan. He had sworn on his faith as a Christian to be true to the United States. It was the United States which gave him the uniform he wore and the sword by his side. Nay, Burr cared nothing for poor Nolan, but had picked him out to aid him in his wicked plots, only because of the uniform he wore. Of course, Nolan did not know this, and it did not excuse him, but it does partly explain why he cursed his country and wished that he might never hear her name again. He never did hear her name but once again. From the moment September 23rd, 1807, till the day he died May 11th, 1863, he never heard her name again. For that half-century and more he was a man without a country. Colonel Morgan, as you may suppose, was terribly shocked. If Nolan had compared George Washington to Benedict Arnold, or had cried, "God save King George," Morgan would not have felt worse. He called the court into his private room, and returned in 15 minutes, with a face white as a sheet, to say, "Prisoner, hear the sentence of the court. The court decides, subject to the approval of the president, that you never hear the name of the United States again." Nolan laughed, but nobody else laughed. The whole room was hushed dead as night for a minute. Then Colonel Morgan added, "Mr. Marshal, take the prisoner to Orleans in an armed boat and deliver him to the naval commander there. Request him to order that no one shall mention the United States to the prisoner while he is on board ship." Colonel Morgan himself went to Washington, and President Jefferson approved the sentence. So a plan was formed to keep Nolan constantly at sea, far from his own country. The ships of our navy took few long cruises then, but one ship was directed to carry the prisoner as far away as it was going, then transfer him to another vessel before it sailed for home. He was to be confined only so far as necessary to prevent his escape, and to make it certain that he never saw or heard of his country again. As soon as a vessel on which Nolan sailed was homeward bound, Nolan was transferred to an outward bound vessel for another cruise. At first he made light of it, but in time he learned something he had not thought of perhaps, that there was no going home for him, even to a prison. There were some 20 such transfers, which took him all over the world, but which kept him all his life at least some 100 miles from the country he had hoped he might never hear of again. Nolan wore his uniform, but with plain buttons. He always had a sentry before his door, but the men were as good to him as his sentence permitted. No mess wanted to have him with them too steadily, because they could never talk about home matters when he was present. More than half the talk men liked to have at sea. They took turns inviting him to dinner, and the captain always asked him on Mondays. He could have any books or papers not printed in America. Newspapers having any mention of America had to be gone over and the allusions cut out. He used to join the men as they were reading on deck, and take his turn in reading aloud. Once they were cruising around the Cape of Good Hope. Somebody got hold of Scott's Lay of the Last Minstrel, which was then new and famous. Nolan was reading to the others when he came to this passage. Breathes there the man with soul so dead, who never to himself hath said, This is my own, my native land, whose heart hath ne'er within him burned, as home his footsteps he hath turned, from wandering on a foreign strand. If such there breathe, go, mark him well, for him no minstrel raptures swell. High though his titles, proud his name, boundless his wealth, as wish can claim. Despite those titles, power and pelf, the wretch consecrated all in self. Here the poor fellow choked, and could not go on, but started up and flung the book into the sea, and fled to his stateroom. It was 2 months before he dared join the men again. There was a change in Nolan after this. He never read aloud again, unless it was the Bible or Shakespeare, or something else he was sure of. He was always shy afterwards, and very seldom spoke unless spoken to, except to a very few friends. He generally had the nervous, tired look of a heart-wounded man. Sometimes he tried to trap people into mentioning his country, but he never succeeded. His sentence was too well known among the men who had him in charge. There was only one day on which, perhaps, he was really happy, except when he knew his lonely life was closing. Once, during the War of 1812, the ship on which he was staying had a fight with an English frigate. A round shot from the enemy entered one of the ports and killed the officer of the gun himself and many of the gun's crew. Now you may say what you choose about courage, but that is not a nice thing to see. But as the men who were not killed picked themselves up, and they and the surgeon's people were carrying off the bodies, there appeared Nolan, in his shirt sleeves, with the rammer in his hand, and, just as if he had been the officer, told them off with authority, who should go to the cockpit with the wounded men, who should stay with him, perfectly cheerily, and with that way which makes men feel sure all is right and is going to be all right. And he finished loading the gun with his own hands, aimed it, and bade the men fire. And there he stayed, captain of that gun, keeping those fellows in spirits, till the enemy struck, sitting on the carriage while the gun was cooling, though he was exposed all the time, showing them easier ways to handle heavy shot, making the raw hands laugh at their own blunders, and when the gun cooled again, getting it loaded and fired twice as often as any other gun on the ship. The Commodore walked forward by way of encouraging the men, and Nolan touched his hat and said, "I am showing them how we do this in the artillery, sir." "I see you are, and I thank you, sir," the Commodore said. "And I shall never forget this day, sir, and you never shall, sir." And, after the whole thing was over, and he had the Englishman's sword, in the midst of the state and ceremony of the quarterdeck, he said, "Where is Mr. Nolan? Ask Mr. Nolan to come here." And where Nolan came, he said, "Mr. Nolan, we are all very grateful to you. You are one of us today. You will be named in the dispatches." And then the Commodore took off his own sword of ceremony, and gave it to Nolan, and made him put it on. Nolan cried like a baby, and well he might. He had not worn a sword since that infernal day at Fort Adams. but always afterwards on occasions of ceremony he wore that quaint old French sword of the Commodore's. The Commodore did mention him in the dispatches, and asked that he might be pardoned. He wrote a special letter to the Secretary of War, but nothing ever came of it. At another time Nolan went with a young officer named Vaughan to overhaul a dirty little schooner which had slaves on board. Nolan was the only one who could speak Portuguese, the language used by the slaves. There were but a few of the negroes. Vaughan had their handcuffs and ankle cuffs knocked off, and put these on the rascals of the schooner's crew. Then Nolan told the blacks that they were free, and that Vaughan would take them to Cape Palmas. Now Cape Palmas was a long way from their native land, and they said, "Not Palmas. Take us home. Take us to our own country. Take us to our own pickaninnies and our own women." One complained that he had not heard from home for more than 6 months. It was terribly hard for Nolan, but he translated these speeches, and told the negroes Vaughan's answer in some fashion. "Tell them yes, yes, yes," Vaughan said. "Tell them they shall go to the mountains of the moon, if they will. If I sail the schooner through the great white desert, they shall go home." And they all fell to kissing Nolan, and wanted to rub his nose with theirs. As they were being rowed back to the ship, he lay in the stern sheets, and said to a young midshipman of whom he was very fond, "Youngster, let that show you what it is to be without a family, without a home, and without a country, and if you are ever tempted to say a word or do a thing that shall put a bar between you and your family, your home and your country, pray God in his mercy to take you at that instant home to his own heaven. Stick by your family, boy. Forget that you have a self, while you do everything for them. Think of your home, boy. Write and send and talk about it. Let it be nearer and nearer to your thought, the farther you have to travel from it, and rush back to it when you are free, as that poor black slave is doing now. And for your country, boy," and the words rattled in his throat, "and for that flag," and he pointed to the ship, "never dream a dream but of serving her as she blinds you, through the service you carry through 1,000 hells. No matter what happens to you, no matter who flatters you or abuses you, never look at another flag. Never let a night pass but you pray God to bless that flag. Remember, boy, that behind all these men you have to do with, behind officers and government, and people even, there is the country herself, your country, and that you belong to her, as you belong to your own mother. Stand by her, boy, as you would stand by your mother. If those devils there had got hold of her today." And then Nolan added, almost in a whisper, "Oh, if anybody had said so to me when I was of your age!" Years passed on, and Nolan's sentence was unrevoked, though his friends had more than once asked for a pardon. The end came when he had been upwards of 50 years at sea, and he asked the ship's doctor for a visit from Captain Danforth, whom he liked. Danforth tells us about Nolan's last hours, and calls him dear old Nolan, so we know his love was returned. The officer saw what a little shrine poor Nolan had made of his stateroom. Up above were the stars and stripes, and round a portrait of Washington he had painted a majestic eagle, with lightnings blazing from his beak, and his foot just clasping the whole globe, which the wings overshadowed. Nolan said, with a sad smile, "Here, you see, I have a country." Over the foot of the bed was a great map of the United States, drawn from memory, which he had there to look upon as he lay in his berth. Quaint old names were on it in large letters: Indiana Territory, Mississippi Territory, and Louisiana Territory. "Danforth," he said, "I know I am dying. I cannot get home. Surely you will tell me something now. Stop, stop! Do not speak till I say what I am sure you know, that there is not in this ship, that there is not in America, God bless her, a more loyal man than I. There cannot be a man who loves the old flag or prays for it as I do. There are 34 stars in it now, Danforth. I thank God for that, though I do not know what their names are. There has never been one taken away. I thank God for that. But tell me something. Tell me everything, Danforth, before I die." Captain Danforth, in writing about it afterwards, says, "I felt like a monster that I had not told him everything before, though obeying orders. Who was I that I should have been acting the tyrant all this time over this dear, sainted old man, who had expiated in his whole manhood's life the madness of a boy's treason?" "Mr. Nolan," he said, "I will tell you everything you ask about." Then he told him the names of all the new states, and drew them on the map. He told him of the inventions, the steamboats, the railroads, and telegraphs. He tried to tell him all that had happened to the great and growing country in 50 years. He told him about Abraham Lincoln, who was then president, except that he could not wound his friend by mentioning a word about the cruel civil war which was then raging. Nolan drank it in and enjoyed it more than we can tell. After that he seemed to grow weary, and said he would go to sleep. He bent Danforth down and kissed him, and said, "Look in my Bible, Captain, when I am gone." Danforth went away with no thought that this was the end. But in an hour, when the doctor went in gently, he found Nolan had breathed away his life with a smile. They looked in his Bible, and there was a slip of paper at the place where he had marked the text: "They desire a country, even a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city." On this slip of paper he had written, "Bury me in the sea. It has been my home, and I love it. But will not some one set up a stone for my memory at Fort Adams or at Orleans, that my disgrace may not be more than I ought to bear? Say on it, 'In memory of Philip Nolan, Lieutenant in the Army of the United States.'" He loved his country as no other man has loved her, but no man deserved less at her hands. End of section 34. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Section number 35 of the Mary Frances Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. The Mary Frances Storybook by Jane Eayre FRYER. Your Flag and My Flag. When the story was finished, the story people did not applaud. They felt sorry for poor Philip who had repented so bitterly. Mary Frances felt sad and sorry too, as she did every time she heard the story, for she had often heard it before. "How Americans love their country!" said the Story King. "They must love it as much as we love our island." "Indeed they do love it," answered Mary Frances patriotically. "I think it is the greatest big country in all the world." The Story People smiled and clapped their hands at this speech, for they admire loyalty wherever shown. "Yes, it is," said the Story Queen, "and we think our island is the greatest little country in the world." "So it is! Indeed it is! I love it next to my own!" cried Mary Frances, and the Story People applauded again. "There is a little poem about the Stars and Stripes that is very popular in America," said the Story Lady, smiling. "Now that the stories are finished for the day, perhaps our guest will recite it for us." Mary Frances blushed, and then rose in her place and recited: "Your flag and my flag, and how it flies today, in your land and my land, and half a world away. Rose red and blood red, the stripes forever gleam, snow white and soul white, the good forefathers' dream. Sky blue and true blue, with stars to gleam aright, the glory guardian of the day, a shelter through the night. Your flag and my flag, and oh, how much it holds! Your land and my land, secure within its folds. Your heart and my heart beat quicker at the sight. Sun-kissed and wind-tossed, red and blue and white. The one flag, the great flag, the flag for me and you, glorified all else beside, the red and white and blue. Your flag and my flag, to every star and stripe, the drums beat as hearts beat, and fifers shrilly pipe. Your flag and my flag, a blessing in the sky. Your hope and my hope, it never hid a lie. Homeland and far land, and half the world around, Old Glory hears our glad salute, and ripples to the sound." Footnote: From the Trail to Boyland, by Wilbur D. Nesbit. Copyright 1904. Used by special permission of the publishers, the Bobbs Merrill Company. End footnote. As Mary Frances sat down, the Story People clapped their hands enthusiastically, and the Ready Writer handed her copies of the stories for the day. The copy of the poem which he had made, he kept for themselves. As Mary Frances and the Story Lady were going out, the Story Queen stopped them and said: "We shall expect you both to dinner tonight. Just a little family party, you know." "Oh, thank you, that will be delightful," both replied. Mary Frances thought ruefully of her best dress hanging uselessly in the closet at home and wished she had it. "But it's no use wishing," she thought. "It's all so unexpected." However, with the help of the Story Lady, she was arrayed for the occasion, and when she saw herself in the mirror she said, "There must be two of us. That doesn't look like me." But it was she. So when they left their apartments and went downstairs into the dining hall, she was in very high spirits. Mary Frances had eaten many dinners, but never one like that. Yet, strange to say, she doesn't remember what she ate. But she does remember how kind and friendly the Story King and Queen were, and how they plied her with questions about her own country. She thinks, perhaps, she bragged a little too much in telling of its wonders, but she excuses herself to herself, thinking, "Well, my country is worth bragging about, I'm sure." During a lull in the conversation, Mary Frances asked the king, "Won't you tell me where all the stories come from?" "With pleasure," he replied. "They come from all countries. The world is full of people who are doing brave and noble deeds, and when we hear of such deeds, we have them written down and pass them on. Of course," he added, "there are other people who are doing cowardly and selfish things, but we don't bother with them, except to punish them as we did the pirate. We see to it that no good story is ever lost. That is why we were so concerned about the lost story." "You can see," said the Queen, "that it keeps us pretty busy." "Indeed it must," returned Mary Frances. "I think it is very kind of you to let me visit you." "Dear child," said the Queen, "we shall make a story about it. Several stories." "Yes, delightful stories," interrupted the Story Lady, "and I shall tell them. Oh, yes, I shall tell them." End of section 35. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Section 36 of the Mary Frances Story Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Mary Frances Story Book by Jane Eayre FRYER. The Last Day on Story Island. The Cricket on the Hearth. A Fairy Tale of Home. Chirp the First. When the Story people were all assembled, the Story Lady began. Today we have only one story, The Cricket on the Hearth, which was first told by one of our greatest storytellers, Charles Dickens, who wrote The Christmas Carol, and many other stories that children love to hear. The Peerybingles. Heyday! The cricket's merrier than ever tonight, I think, said John, stopping, in his slow way, to listen to its musical chirp, chirp, chirp. "And it's sure to bring us good fortune, John. It always has done so. To have a cricket on the hearth is the luckiest thing in the world." That is what John Peerybingle's little wife Dot said one stormy night after John had come in from delivering packages and boxes, and she had given him his tea and had put the baby to sleep. For John Peerybingle was a local expressman, or, as they say in England, a carrier. "The first time I heard its cheerful little note, John," Dot continued, "was the night you brought me home, when you brought me to my new home here, its little mistress, nearly a year ago. You recollect, John?" Oh, yes, John remembered. I should think so. Its chirp was such a welcome to me. It seemed so full of promise and encouragement. It seemed to say you would be kind and gentle with me, and would not expect to find an old head on the shoulders of your foolish little wife. I had a fear of that, John, then. John thoughtfully patted one of the shoulders, and then the head of his little wife, as though to say, no, no, he had no such expectation. He had been quite content to take them as they were. The cricket spoke the truth, John, for you have been, I am sure, the most considerate, the most affectionate of husbands. This has been a happy home, John, and I love the cricket for its sake." "Why, so do I, then," said the carrier. "So do I, Dot. I love it for the many times I have heard it," Dot went on musing, "and the many thoughts its harmless music has given me. Sometimes, in the twilight, when I have felt a little downhearted, John, before the precious baby came to keep me company and make the house gay, when I have thought how lonely you would be if I should die, or I should be if you should die, its chirp, chirp, chirp upon the hearth has filled me with new trust and confidence. For you see, John, I was afraid, being so much younger than you, that you might not find me at all suitable as a wife, and that you might find it hard to learn to love me as you would if I were older and had had more experience. I was thinking just before you came in tonight, dear, how the cricket has cheered me at such times, and I love it for their sake." "And so do I," repeated John. "But, Dot, how you talk! I learned to love you? I had learned that long before I brought you here to be the cricket's little mistress, Dot." She laid her hand, an instant, on his arm, and looked up at him as if she would have told him something. Next moment, she was down upon her knees before the basket of packages which John had brought in from his cart. Perhaps some of them would be called for, the others he would deliver in the morning. "There are not many of them to-night, John. Why, what's this round box? Heart alive, John, it's a wedding cake." "Leave a woman to find that out," said John admiringly. "Now, a man would never have thought of it. But it's my belief that if you packed a wedding cake in a tea chest, or in a feather bed, or in a salmon keg, a woman would be sure to find it out directly. Yes, I called for it at the pastry cook's, and it weighs, I don't know what, whole 100 weights," cried Dot, making a great show of trying to lift it. "Whose is it, John? Where is it going?" "Read the writing on the other side," said John. "Why, John! My goodness, John!" exclaimed Dot. "Ah, who'd have thought it?" John returned. "You never mean to say," asked Dot, sitting on the floor and shaking her head at him, "that it's for Gruff and Tackleton, the toy maker?" John nodded. Mrs. Peerybingle nodded also, 50 times at least, in dumb and pitying amazement, and Tilly Slowboy, the nursemaid, and helper of all work, began to talk in an undertone to the baby, who had awakened, as she walked to and fro with him in her arms. Was it for Gruff's and Tackleton's, then, and would it call at the pastry cook's for wedding cakes, and did its mothers know the boxes when its fathers brought them home, and so on. "And that marriage is really to come about?" said Dot, after seeing that the baby was all right. "Why, she and I were girls at school together, John." John might have been thinking of how Dot looked then, but he made no answer. "And he's as old as unlike May. Why, how many years older than you is Gruff and Tackleton, John? How many more cups of tea shall I drink at one sitting than Gruff and Tackleton ever took in 4 sittings?" "I wonder," replied John good-humoredly. But even this brought no smile to the face of his little wife. The cricket, too, had stopped. Somehow the room was not so cheerful as it had been. Nothing like it. The strange old gentleman. "So these are all the parcels, are they, John?" she asked, after a little while. "So these are all the parcels, John?" "That's all," said John. "Why, no, I declare, I've clean forgotten the old gentleman." "The old gentleman?" "In the cart," said John. "He was asleep, down in the straw, the last time I saw him. I've very nearly remembered him twice since I came in, but he went out of my head again." John hastily rose and lighting a candle went out the door. "Halloa, ya hip there! Rouse up! That's my hearty!" he called as he made his way to the wagon shed. Soon the stranger stood, bareheaded and motionless in the middle of the room. He had long white hair, good features, singularly bold and well defined for an old man. His eyes were dark and bright and smiling. He saluted the carrier's wife by gravely bowing. His clothes were very quaint and old-fashioned, a long, long way behind the time. Their color was brown all over. In his hand he carried a great brown club or walking stick. He struck this upon the floor and it fell open and became a chair on which he sat down quite composedly. "There," said the carrier, turning to his wife, "that's the way I found him, sitting by the roadside, upright as a millstone, and almost as deaf as one. Sitting in the open air, John." "In the open air," replied the carrier, "just at dusk. Will you take me along?" he asked, and gave me 18 pence. Then he got into the cart, and here he is." "He's going, John, I think." "Not at all. He was only going to speak." "If you please, I was to be left till called for," said the stranger, mildly. "Don't mind me." With that he took a pair of spectacles from one of his large pockets, and a book from another, and leisurely began to read. Boxer, the carrier's big dog, came sniffing at his legs, but he took no more notice of Boxer than if he had been a lamb. The carrier and his wife glanced at each other in perplexity. The stranger raised his head, and looking from Dot toward John, said, "Your daughter, my good friend?" "Wife," said John. "Niece?" asked the stranger. "Wife!" roared John. "Indeed," observed the stranger. "Surely very young." Dot took the baby from the couch where Tilly Slowboy had laid him. The stranger quietly resumed his reading, but before he had read 2 lines, he interrupted his reading to say to John, "Baby yours?" John gave a gigantic nod, equal to an answer given through a speaking trumpet. "Girl?" asked the stranger. "Boy!" roared John. "Also very young, eh?" Mrs. Peerybingle instantly spoke. 2 months and 3 days. Vaccinated just 6 weeks ago. Took very finely. Considered by the doctors a remarkable beautiful child. Equal to the general run of children at 5 months old. Takes notice of everything. May seem impossible to you, but true." Here the breathless little mother, who had been shrieking these short sentences into the old man's ear until her face was crimson, held the baby up before him to prove her words, while Tilly Slowboy sprang around in cow-like gambols to amuse the infant, uttering words which sounded like "Catcher, catcher." "Hark!" said John. "He's called for." Sure enough, there's someone at the door. "Open it, Tilly. Caleb Plummer." Before she could reach it, however, it was opened from the outside, for it was a primitive sort of door with a latch that anyone could lift if he chose. In came a little, meagre, thoughtful, dingy-faced man. He seemed to have made himself a greatcoat from the burlap covering of some old box, for, when he turned to shut the door, and keep the weather out, one could read upon the back of the garment the letters G and T in large black capitals, also the word glass in smaller capitals. "Good evening, John," said the little man. "Good evening, Mum." "Good evening, Tilly." "Good evening, unbeknown. How's baby, Mum?" "Boxer's pretty well, I hope." "All well and thriving, Caleb," replied Dot. "I am sure you need only to look at the dear child for one to know that." "And I'm sure I only need to look at you for another," said Caleb. "Or at John for another. Or Tilly, as far as that goes. Or certainly at Boxer." "Busy just now, Caleb?" asked the carrier. "Why, pretty busy, John," he returned. "Pretty much so. There's a lot of demand for Noah's Arks at present. I'd like to be able to take more pains in making the families, but I can't do it at the price. It would be a satisfaction, though, to one's mind, to make it plain which was Shems and Hams, and which was wives. Ah, well, have you got anything in the parcel line for me, John?" The carrier put his hand into the pocket of the coat he had taken off, and brought out a tiny flower pot, carefully wrapped in moss and tissue paper. "There it is," he said, adjusting it with great care. "Not so much as a leaf damaged. Full of buds." Caleb's dull eye brightened as he took it, and thanked him. "It was expensive, Caleb," said the carrier. "Very dear at this season." "Never mind that. It would be cheap to me, whatever it cost," returned the little man. "Anything else, John?" "A small box," replied the carrier. "Here you are." "For Caleb Plummer," read the old man, spelling out the directions. "With cash, John? I don't think it's for me." "With care," corrected the carrier, looking over his shoulder. "Where do you make out cash?" "Oh, to be sure," said Caleb. "It's all right. With care. Yes, that's mine. It might have been with cash, if my dear boy in South America had lived, John. You loved him like a son, didn't you? You needn't say you did. I know, of course." He read again, "Caleb Plummer, with care. Yes, it's all right. It's a box of doll's eyes for my daughter's work. I wish it was her own sight in a box, John." "I wish it was, or could be," cried the carrier. "Thank'ee," said the little man. "You speak very hearty. To think that she should never see the dolls, and them a staring at her so bold all day long. That's where it cuts. What's the cost, John? What's the damage?" "I'll damage you," said John, "if you ask." "Well, it's like you to say that," observed the little man. "It's your kind way. Let me see. I think that's all." "I think not," said the carrier. "Try again." "Something for our governor, asked Caleb after thinking a little while. "To be sure. That's what I came for. But my head's so full of them Noah's arks and things. He hasn't been here, has he?" "Not he," returned the carrier. "He's too busy, courting." "He's coming, though," said Caleb, "for he told me to keep on the near side of the road going home, and it was 10 to 1 he'd take me up. I'd better go, by the way." He turned to Dot. "You couldn't have the goodness to let me pinch Boxer's tail, Mum, for half a moment, could you?" "Why, Caleb, what a question!" "Oh, never mind, Mum," said the little man. "He mightn't like it, perhaps. There's a small order come in for toys, dogs that will bark, and I wish to go as close to nature as possible for a 6 pence. That's all. Never mind, Mum." It happened that Boxer just at that moment began to bark with zeal, but, as this bark meant the approach of some new visitor, Caleb, postponing his study of dogs' barks, shouldered the big round box of wedding cake and said good-bye. He might have spared himself the trouble, however, for he met his employer upon the threshold. "Tackleton." "Oh, you are here, are you? Wait a bit. I'll take you home." He turned to John. "John Peerybingle, my service to you. More of my service to your pretty wife. Handsomer every day, and younger." "I should be astonished at your paying compliments, Mr. Tackleton," said Dot, not altogether pleasantly. "But for what I have just heard about you, being engaged to be married, you know all about it, then." "I have gotten myself to believe it somehow," said Dot. "After a hard struggle, I suppose." "Very." Tackleton, the toy merchant, was well known in the neighborhood. Many people called him Gruff and Tackleton, the name of the firm when Gruff was Tackleton's partner. Although Tackleton had bought out Gruff's interest years before, the name still remained. It was odd that such a man should have been a toy maker, for he had no interest in toys whatever. He despised them, and wouldn't have bought one for the world. The only toys in his shop which he could abide were the ugly ones. Hideous, red-eyed jacks in boxes, vampire kites, and fiery dragons really did give him some pleasure, for he saw that they scared little children. A very pleasant person, Tackleton. Not the kind of person you would think was going to be married, and to a young wife, too. A beautiful young wife. He didn't look much like a bridegroom as he stood in the carrier's kitchen, with a twist in his dry face, and a screw in his body, and his hat jerked over the bridge of his nose, and his hands tucked down into the bottom of his pockets, and his whole sarcastic, ill-conditioned self peering out of one little corner of one little eye, like the concentrated essence of any number of ravens. But a bridegroom he was designed to be. "In 3 days' time, next Thursday, the last day of the first month of the year, is my wedding day," said Tackleton. "Did I mention that he had always one eye wide open and one eye nearly shut? And the eye nearly shut was always the expressive eye? I don't think I did." "That's my wedding day," said Tackleton, rattling his money in his pocket. "Why, that's the anniversary of our wedding, too!" exclaimed the carrier. "Ha, ha!" laughed Tackleton. "Odd! You're just another couple as we will be, just." At this speech, Dot was most indignant. What next would the man say? As though her John resembled Tackleton in any particular. "I say, a word with you," murmured Tackleton, nudging the carrier with his elbow, and taking him off a little way. "You'll come to the wedding, won't you? We're in the same boat, you know." "How in the same boat?" asked John. "Why, you're not so youthful as your wife, yourself," said Tackleton, with another nudge. "Come and spend an evening with us beforehand." "Why, demanded John, astonished at this hospitality. "Why?" returned the other. "That's a new way to receive an invitation. Why, for pleasure, to be sociable, you know, and all that." "I thought you were never sociable," said John, in his plain way. "As you like. What does it matter? Your company will produce a favourable impression on Mrs. Tackleton, that will be. You'll say you'll come?" "We have arranged to keep our wedding day at home," said John. "We think, you see, that home—" "Bah! What's home?" cried Tackleton. "4 walls and a ceiling. Why don't you kill that cricket?" "I would. I always do. I hate their noise. You'll say you'll come to-morrow evening?" "You kill the crickets, said John. "Scrunch 'em, sir," returned the other, setting his heel heavily on the floor. "Then you won't give us to-morrow evening? Well, next day you go out visiting, I know. I'll meet you there, and bring my wife that is to be. It'll do her good. You're agreeable?" "Thank ye. What's that?" "Dot is upset." It was a loud cry from the carrier's wife, a loud, sharp, sudden cry, that made the room ring like a glass bell that was struck. She had risen from her seat and stood like one transfixed by terror and surprise. The stranger had gone toward the fire to warm himself, but he was quite still. "Dot!" cried the carrier. "Darling Dot! What's the matter?" They were all about her in a moment. Caleb, who had been dozing on the cake box in the first start, seized Tilly Slowboy by the hair, but immediately apologized. "Mary!" exclaimed the carrier, for Dot's real name was Mary, Dot being only a pet name of her husband's. "Mary, dear, are you ill? What is it? Tell me, dear." But at first she could not answer. She wept bitterly, and covered her face with her apron, then burst into a wild fit of laughter, and then started crying again. At length she let John lead her to the fire, where she sat down. The old man was standing there as before. "I'm better, John," she said. "I'm quite well. It was only a fancy, something coming before my eyes. It's gone, quite gone now." But why did she look at the old gentleman, as if addressing him, thought John. Was her mind wandering? "I'm glad it's gone," muttered Tackleton, turning the expressive eye around the room. "I wonder where it's gone, and what it was. Humph! Caleb, come here. Who's that man with the gray hair?" "I don't know, sir," Caleb answered in a whisper. "Never saw him before in all my life. He'd make a beautiful figure for a nutcracker. Quite a new model." "Not ugly enough," said Tackleton. "Or a match safe," Caleb continued. "What a model! Unscrew his head to put the matches in. Let them fall down to his neck, and take out." "Not half ugly enough," said Tackleton. "Nothing in him at all. Come, bring that box. All right now, I hope, Mrs. Peerybingle?" "Oh, quite right, quite right," said the little woman, waving him hurriedly away. "Good night." "Good night," said Tackleton. "Good night, John Peerybingle. Take care how you carry that box, Caleb. Let it fall, and I'll murder you. Dark as pitch, and weather worse than ever, Good night." So, with another sharp look round the room, he went out the door, followed by Caleb with the wedding cake on his head. The carrier had been so much astonished by his little wife, and so busily trying to soothe her, that he had scarcely been conscious of the stranger's presence until now, when he looked up and saw him standing there, their only guest. "He didn't belong to them, you see," said John. "I must give him a hint to go." Just at that moment the old gentleman came toward him, saying, "I beg your pardon, friend, but since my attendant has not come and the weather is so bad, can you, in your kindness, let me rent a bed here?" "Yes, yes," cried Dot. "Yes, certainly." "Oh!" exclaimed the carrier, surprised by the quickness of her consent. "Well, I don't object. Still I'm not quite sure." "Hush!" she interrupted. "Dear John, please." "Why, he's stone deaf," urged John. "I know, but—" She turned to the stranger. "Yes, sir, certainly. Yes, certainly." Then to John, "I'll make him up a bed directly, John." As she hurried off to do it, The fluttering way she did it was so strange that the carrier looked after her, quite dumbfounded. "Did its mothers make up a beds then?" cried Tilly Slowboy to the baby. "And did its hair grow brown and curly when its caps was lifted off, and frightened it, as precious pets, a-sitting by the fire?" "What frightened Dot, I wonder?" thought the carrier, pacing to and fro, and half listening to Tilly's silly chatter. The bed was soon made ready, and the stranger, who would not take anything but a cup of tea, retired. After Dot put the baby to bed, she arranged the great comfortable fireside chair for the carrier, and filled his pipe for him. Then she brought her little stool, and, placing it beside his knee, sat down for a cozy chat. But the carrier fell to dreaming, and Boxer, who was stretched at his feet, I am quite ashamed to say, snored aloud. Just then the cricket began its song, and Dot, too, fell a-dreaming. But what was that young figure of a man which remained there, singly and alone? Why did it linger still, so near her, with its arm upon the chimney-piece, ever repeating in a whisper, "Married, and not to me?" Section 36.
Section number 37 of the Mary Frances Story Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. The Mary Frances Story Book by Jane Eyre FRYER. Chirp the Second. Bertha, the blind girl, and her father. Caleb Plummer, the toy maker, and his blind daughter lived all alone by themselves, as the story books say, in a little cracked nutshell of a wooden house, close to the big establishment of Gruff and Tackleton, the toy merchants. I have said that Caleb and his poor blind daughter lived here. I should have said that Caleb lived here, and his poor blind daughter lived somewhere else, in a sort of enchanted fairyland, where no shabbiness or poverty or trouble ever entered. For Caleb, in the magic of his devoted, deathless love for his daughter, played a little game of pretend, which made the blind girl think their home beautiful, her father rich and handsome, and that nothing was lacking which they needed. The blind girl never knew that the ceilings were broken and the walls blotched, and bare of plaster here and there, the beams warped and bending because of age. The blind girl never knew that the woodwork was rotting and the paper peeling off the walls, and the little building withering away. The blind girl never knew that the dishes were ugly and cracked, and the carpets threadbare, that sorrow and faint-heartedness were in the house, that Caleb's scanty hairs were turning grayer and more gray before her sightless face. The blind girl never knew that they had a master, cold, exacting, and not caring how they got along, never knew that Tackleton was Tackleton, in fact, for Caleb led her to think his rough words were meant for jokes, that he was very good to them, and had a peculiarity in that he could not bear to be thanked for any favor he had done. You know why he did this. It was because he felt so sorry for poor blind Bertha that he deceived her into thinking everything lovely and fair in order that she might be happier. He, too, had a cricket singing on the hearth when his motherless girl was very young, and when he listened to its music, he made up his mind to cheer the little one's dark way by every means he could devise. Caleb and his daughter were at work together in their usual working room, which served them for their ordinary living room as well, and a strange place it was. There were houses in it, furnished and unfurnished, for dolls of all stations in life. Nice houses for dolls of moderate means, smaller houses for dolls not so well off, fine town residences for dolls of high estate. Some of the houses were already furnished with a view to the conveniences of dolls of limited income. Others could be furnished on notice from the shelves near by, which were full of chairs and tables, sofas, bedsteads, and other articles of furniture. Then there were many dolls themselves of all kinds and from all stations of life. There were various other samples of his handicraft besides dolls and dolls' houses in Caleb Plummer's room. There were Noah's arks, in which the birds and beasts were uncommonly tight fit, I assure you. There were scores of little carts, which, when the wheels went round, performed most doleful music. There were small fiddles and drums, and no end of cannon, shields, and spears. There were little fellows in red breeches who would tumble down head first along a piece of tape. There were old gentleman dolls who would fly over trapeze bars when pressed in the right place. There were beasts of all sorts, horses in particular, of every breed, from the little spotted gray on 4 legs to the thoroughbred rocked on his highest mettle. There were dozens and dozens of other little toys, but you already can imagine how the room looked. In the midst of all these objects, Caleb and his daughter sat at work, the blind girl busy as a doll's dressmaker, Caleb painting a desirable doll's family mansion. "So you were out in the rain last night, Father, in your beautiful new gray coat," said Caleb's daughter. "In my beautiful new gray coat," answered Caleb, glancing towards a clothes rack in the room on which the burlap garment was carefully hung to dry. "How glad I am you bought it, Father, and such a stylish tailor." "It is too good for me," said Caleb. The blind girl resting from her work and laughed with delight. "Too good, Father! What can be too good for you?" "I'm half ashamed to wear it, though," said Caleb, watching the effect of what he said on her brightening face. "Upon my word! When I hear the boys and people say behind me, 'Hallo, here's a swell!' I don't know which way to look. And when the beggar wouldn't go away last night, and when I said I am a very common man, said, 'No, your honor, bless your honor, don't say that,' I was quite ashamed. I really felt as if I hadn't a right to wear it." Happy blind girl! How merry she was with that idea. "I see you, Father," she said, clapping her hands, "as plainly as if I had the eyes I never want when you are with me." "A blue coat." "Bright blue," said Caleb. "Yes, yes, bright blue," exclaimed the girl, turning up her radiant face. "The color I can just remember in the blessed sky. You told me it was blue before, a bright blue coat." "Made loose to the figure," suggested Caleb. "Yes, loose to the figure," cried the blind girl, laughing heartily. "And in it, you dear Father, with your merry eye, your smiling face, your free step, and your dark hair, looking so young and handsome." "There, there," said Caleb. "I shall be vain presently." "I think you are already," cried the blind girl, pointing at him in her glee. "I know you, Father. Ha, ha, ha! I found you out, you see." How different the picture in her mind from Caleb as he sat observing her. She had spoken of his free step. She was right in that. For years and years he had never once crossed their threshold with his own slow pace, but with a footfall free and sprightly for her to hear, and never, even when his heart was heaviest, had he forgotten the light tread that was to render her own so cheerful and courageous. "There we are," said Caleb, falling back a step or two to better judge his work. "It's a pity the whole front of this doll's house opens at once. If there was only a staircase in it, now, and regular doors to go in at! But that's the worst of my work. I'm always trying to make believe." "You are speaking quite softly. Are you tired, father?" "Tired?" echoed Caleb, with a great burst of enthusiasm. "What should tire me, Bertha? I was never tired. What does it mean?" To give greater force to his words, he checked himself in the middle of a yawn, and began to hum a song. He sang it with a pretended carefree manner that made his face look 1,000 times more meagre and more thoughtful than before. Tackleton Comes In. Just then Tackleton put his head in at the door. "What? You're singing, are you?" he thundered. "Go it! I can't sing." Nobody would have suspected that he could. He hadn't a singing face by any means. "I can't afford to sing," said Tackleton. "I'm glad you can. I hope you can afford to work, too. Hardly time for both, I should think." Caleb turned toward his daughter, and said in a low tone, "If you could only see him, Bertha! How he's winking at me! Such a man to joke! You'd think, if you didn't know him, he was in earnest, wouldn't you now?" The blind girl smiled and nodded. "The bird that can sing and won't sing must be made to sing," grumbled Tackleton. "What about the owl that can't sing, and oughtn't to sing, and will sing? Is there anything that he should be made to do?" "The way he's winking at me this moment," whispered Caleb to his daughter. "Oh, my gracious!" "Always merry and light-hearted with us!" cried the smiling Bertha. "Oh, you're there, aren't you?" answered Tackleton. "Poor idiot!" He really did believe she was an idiot, and strange to say, he thought her an idiot because she was fond of him. "Well, being there, how are you?" said Tackleton, in his grudging way. "Oh, well, quite well, and as happy as even you could wish me to be. As happy as you would make the whole world, if you could." "Poor idiot!" muttered Tackleton. "No gleam of reason. Not a gleam." The blind girl took his hand, and held it a moment in her own two hands, and laid her cheek against it tenderly, before releasing it. There was so much affectionate gratitude in the act, that Tackleton himself was moved to say, in a milder growl than usual, "What's the matter now?" "I stood the little plant beside my pillow when I went to sleep last night, and remembered it in my dreams. When the day came, and the glorious red sun—" "The red sun, father." "Red in the mornings and in the evenings, Bertha," said poor Caleb, with a woeful glance at his employer. "When it rose, and bright light came into the room, I turned the little tree towards it, and blessed heaven for making such precious things, and blessed you for sending it to cheer me." "Whew!" said Tackleton under his breath. "We're getting on. The next thing will be the padded cell." Meanwhile Caleb looked as if he were uncertain whether Tackleton had done anything deserving of praise or not. Yet he knew that with his own hands he had brought the little rose tree home for her so carefully, and that with his own lips he made her believe that it was a gift from Tackleton, in order to keep her from suspecting how much he every day denied himself to save the money it cost, that she might be happier. "Bertha," said Tackleton, with for once a show of cordiality, "come here." "Oh, I can come straight to you. You needn't guide me." "Shall I tell you a secret, Bertha?" "If you will," she answered eagerly. How bright the darkened face looked! How anxious the listening head! "This is the day on which that spoiled child, John Peerybingle's wife, pays her regular visit to you. Makes what she calls her picnic here, ain't it?" said Tackleton, with a look of distaste for the affair. "Yes," replied Bertha, "this is the day." "I thought so," said Tackleton. "I should like to join the party." "Do you hear that, father?" cried Bertha in delight. Yes, yes, I heard, murmured Caleb, with the look somewhat of a sleepwalker. But I don't believe it. You see, said Tackleton, I want to bring the Peerybingles a little more into the company of May Fielding, for I am going to be married to May. Married! Cried the blind girl, starting from him. Oh, she's such a confounded idiot, muttered Tackleton, that I was afraid she'd never comprehend. Ah, yes, Bertha, married. Church, parson, clerk, bells, satin, veils, and all the rest of the tomfoolery. A wedding, you know, a wedding. Don't you know what a wedding is? I know, replied the blind girl gently. I understand. Do you? Muttered Tackleton. It's more than I expected. Then aloud, well, on that account, I want to join the party, and bring May and her mother. I'll send in a little something or other before the afternoon. A cold leg of mutton, or some comfortable trifle of that sort. You'll expect me? Yes, she answered, turning away. I don't think you will, muttered Tackleton, looking at her, for you seem to have forgotten all about it already, Caleb. I may venture to say I'm here, I suppose, thought Caleb. Sir? Take care she don't forget what I've been saying to her. She never forgets, returned Caleb. It is one of the few things she ain't clever in. Every man thinks his geese swans, observed the toy merchant, with a shrug of his shoulders. Poor idiot! Having delivered this remark with much contempt, old Gruff and Tackleton went out. Bertha's eyes. Bertha remained where he had left her, lost in thought. The gaiety had vanished from her face, and it was very sad. 3 or 4 times she shook her head as if bewailing some loss. It was not until Caleb had been busy for some time in yoking a team of wooden horses to the tongue of a little wooden wagon by the simple means of nails driven through the vital parts of their bodies that she drew near his workbench, and, sitting down beside him, said, Father, I am lonely. I want to borrow your eyes. Here they are, said Caleb, always ready. They are more yours than mine, Bertha, any hour in the 24. What shall your eyes do for you, dear? My patient, willing eyes, the blind girl said. Will they look around the room, father? All right. No sooner than that done, Bertha. Tell me about it. It's much the same as usual, said Caleb. Homely but snug. The gay colors on the walls, the bright flowers on the plates and other dishes, the shining wood, where there are no panels, the general cheerfulness and neatness of the building, all make it very pretty. Cheerful and neat it was, wherever Bertha's hands could busy themselves, but nowhere else were cheerfulness and neatness possible in the old crazy shed which Caleb's fancy painted with such pleasant description. You have your working clothes on, and are not so gallant as when you wear the handsome coat, said Bertha, touching him. Not quite so gallant, answered Caleb. Pretty lively, though. Father, said the blind girl, drawing close to his side, and putting one arm around his neck, tell me something about May. Is she very pretty? She is indeed, said Caleb, and she was indeed. It was quite a rare thing for Caleb not to draw upon his imagination. I can imagine her, said Bertha. Her hair is dark, darker than mine. Her voice is sweet and musical. I know. I have often loved to hear it. Her form. There is not a doll in the room can compare with her, said Caleb. And her eyes. He stopped, for Bertha's arm around his neck had given a sudden pressure. He coughed a moment, hammered a moment, then began to sing the gay song about the sparkling bowl, a thing he always did when in such difficulties. "Now, about your friend, our benefactor, Mr. Tackleton. I am never tired, you know, of hearing about him. Now, was I ever?" she said hastily. "Of course not," answered Caleb, "and with reason." "Ah, with much reason!" cried the blind girl so fervently that Caleb began to doubt if he had been wise in deceiving her. "Tell me about him, dear father," said Bertha, "many times again. His face is kind and tender, honest and true. I am sure it is. The goodness in his heart shines out in his countenance." "And makes it noble," added Caleb, who was rather desperate by now. "And makes it noble!" cried the blind girl. "He is older than May, father." "Yes, quite a little older, but that don't signify," said Caleb. "Oh, no, father. Just to think, she can do so much for him when he grows old and infirm, and can nurse him if he gets ill, and help him in every way. Will she do all this, father?" "No doubt of it," said Caleb. "I love her for that, father. I love her with all my heart," exclaimed the blind girl. The Carrier's Cart. In the meantime there had been a lively scene at John Peerybingle's, for little Mrs. Peerybingle naturally couldn't think of going anywhere without the baby, and to get the baby ready took time. Not that there was so much of the baby, but there was so much to do about it, and it all had to be done by easy stages. For instance, when the baby was got, by hook or by crook, to a certain point in dressing, and you might have supposed that another touch or two would finish him off, and turn him out a tip-top baby, he was unexpectedly extinguished in a warm nightgown, and hustled off to bed, where he simmered, so to speak, between sheets and blankets, for the best part of an hour. From this place of inaction he was recalled, shining very much, and roaring violently, to partake of his luncheon, after which he went to sleep again. Then Mrs. Peerybingle took the opportunity to make herself look as fine as possible, and Miss Slowboy put on her best bib and tucker. By this time the baby, being all alive again, was dressed by the united efforts of Mrs. Peerybingle and Miss Slowboy, and put into his cream-colored coat and flannel cap, and so, in course of time, they all three got to the door, when John's old horse stood tearing up the road with impatient autographs, and from what Boxer might be seen a little distance down the road, looking back, tempting the horse to come on without orders. If you think that Mrs. Peerybingle needed a chair or anything of that kind to help her climb into the cart, you are mistaken, or you don't know John Peerybingle, for before you could have seen him, he lifted her from the ground, and there she was in place, fresh and rosy, saying, "Oh, John, how can you?" "All ready?" asked John, starting off, after Miss Slowboy and the baby were in place. "John, you've got the basket with the veal and ham pie and other things?" asked Dot. "If you haven't, you must turn around again this very minute." "You're a nice little article," replied the carrier, "to be talking about turning round after keeping me a full quarter of an hour. I am sorry for it, John," said Dot, "but I really could not think of going to Bertha's. I would not do it, John, on any account, without the veal and ham pie and things. Whoa!" The last word was addressed to the horse, who didn't mind at all. "Oh, do turn around, John," begged Mrs. Peerybingle. "Please." "It'll be time enough to do that," said John, "when I begin to leave things behind. The basket's here safe enough." What a hard-hearted monster you must be, John, not to have said so at once, and saved me such a turn. I declare I wouldn't go to Bertha's without the veal and ham pie, and things for any money. Regularly, once a fortnight, ever since we have been married, we have had our little picnic. If anything were to go wrong with it, I should almost think we were never to be lucky again." "It was a kind thought in the first place," said the carrier, "and I honor you for it, little woman." "My dear John," replied Dot, turning very red, "don't talk about honoring me. Good gracious!" "By the by," observed the carrier, "that old gentleman—" Dot looked embarrassed. "He is an odd fish," said the carrier. "Can't make him out. I don't believe there's any harm in him, though." "None at all. I'm sure there's none at all." "Yes?" said the carrier, with his eyes attracted to her face because she had spoken so earnestly. "Well, I am glad you feel so certain about it, because it makes me feel surer. It's curious he should have taken it into his head to ask us for lodgings, ain't it? Things come about so strangely." "So very strangely," she rejoined in a low voice, scarcely audible. "However, he's a good-natured old gentleman," said John, "and pays as a gentleman, and I think his word is to be relied upon, like a gentleman's. I had quite a long talk with him this morning. He can hear me better already, he says, as he gets more used to my voice. He told me a great deal about himself, and I told him a good deal about myself, and a rare lot of questions he asked me. I told him about having two routes, you know, in my business, one day going to the right from our house and back again, another day going left from our house and back again, for he's a stranger and don't know the names of the places about here. And he seemed quite pleased. 'Why,' he says, 'then I shall be returning your way tonight. I thought I'd be coming in exactly the opposite direction. That's capital. I may trouble you for another lift, perhaps, but I'll promise not to fall asleep again.' He was sound asleep, surely. Dot, what are you thinking of?" "Thinking of John? I was listening to you." "Oh, that's all right," said the carrier. "I was afraid, from the look of your face, that I had gone rambling on so long as to set you thinking of something else. I was very near it, I'll be bound." Dot making no reply, they jogged on for some time in silence. But it was not very easy to remain silent long in John Peerybingle's cart, for everybody on the road had something to say, though it might only be "How are you?" and indeed it was very often nothing else. Sometimes passengers on foot or on horseback plodded on a little way beside the cart, just for the pleasure of having a chat. Then, too, everybody knew Boxer, all along the road, especially the fowls and pigs, who, when they saw him coming, running with his body all on one side and his ears pricked up inquisitively, would make tracks, and not wait for any nearer acquaintance. Wherever he went, somebody or another might cry, "Hello, here's Boxer," and with that, out came at least two or three other somebodies to bid John Peerybingle and his pretty wife good day. The packages and parcels to be delivered were as numerous as usual, and it required many stops to give them out. This was not the worst part of the journey by any means. Some people were so full of wonder about their parcels, and other people so full of directions about the parcels they were sending off by John, and John took so keen an interest in all the parcels, that it was as good as a play, and Dot thoroughly enjoyed it, as she looked on from her seat in the cart. The trip was a little foggy, to be sure, in the January weather, and was raw and cold, but who cared for such trifles? Not Dot, decidedly. Not Tilly Slowboy, for she deemed sitting in the cart, on any terms, the highest point of human joys. Not the baby, I'll be bound, for it's not in baby nature to be warmer or more sound asleep than the blessed young Peerybingle was, all the way. You couldn't see very far in the fog, of course, but you could see a great deal. It's astonishing how much you may see in a thicker fog than that, if you will only take the trouble to look for it. Why, even to sit looking for hazy fairy rings and ghostly figures near the hedges and trees was a pleasant occupation, to make no mention of the unexpected shapes in which the trees themselves came out of the mist and glided in again. In one place there was a great mound of weeds burning, and they watched the fire flaring through the fog, with here and there a dash of red in it, until, because of getting smoke up her nose, as she explained, Miss Slowboy choked and woke the baby, who wouldn't go to sleep again. But Boxer, who was in advance a quarter of a mile or so, had passed the outskirts of the town, and gained the corner of the street where Caleb and his daughter lived, and long before they reached the door, he and the blind girl were on the pavement waiting to receive them. The party at Caleb's. May Fielding was already there, and so was her mother, a little querulous chip of an old lady with a peevish face. Gruff and Tackleton was also there, pretending to be agreeable and perfectly at home, and really quite as much out of his element as a fish out of water. "May, my dear old friend!" cried Dot, running up to meet her. "What happiness to see you!" Her old friend was as glad as she, and it really was, if you believe me, a pleasant sight to see them embrace each other. Tackleton had shown taste, beyond all question. May was very pretty, and so was Dot pretty. They simply set each other's beauty off, and, as John Peerybingle came near saying, they ought to have been born sisters, which was the only improvement you could have suggested. Tackleton had brought his leg of mutton, and, wonderful to relate, a tart beside. But he could afford such generosity this time. One didn't get married every day. And in addition to those dainties, there were the veal and ham pie and things, as Mrs. Peerybingle called them, which were chiefly nuts and oranges and cakes. When the repast was set forth on the table, together with Caleb's contribution, a bowl of smoking potatoes, which was all he was allowed to provide, Tackleton led his future mother-in-law to the post of honor. Why, she was gotten up for the occasion, even wearing gloves. Caleb sat next to his daughter. Dot and her old school friend were side by side. The carrier took care of the bottom of the table. Mrs. Slowboy was seated a little distance away, far from every other article of furniture but the chair she sat on, that she might have nothing to knock the baby's head against. She was delighted not only to take care of the baby, but to stare around at the toys. "Ah, May," said Dot, "dear, dear, what changes! To talk these merry school days makes one young again." "Why, you ain't particularly old at any time, are you?" said Tackleton. "Look at my sober, plodding husband there," returned Dot. "He adds 20 years to my age at least. Don't you, John?" "40," John replied. "How many you'll add to May's, I am sure I don't know," said Dot, laughing. but she can't be much less than 100 years of age on her next birthday." "Ha, ha!" laughed Tackleton. Hollow as a drum was the laugh, though, and he looked as if he could have twisted Dot's neck comfortably. "Dear, dear!" said Dot. "Only think how we used to talk sometimes about the husbands we would choose. I don't know how lively and gay mine was not to be. And as to May's, oh dear! I don't know whether to laugh or cry when I think what silly girls we were." May seemed to know which to do, for the color flashed into her face and tears stood in her eyes. "We little thought how things would come about," said Dot. "I never fixed on John, I am sure. I never so much as thought of him. And if I had told you you were ever to be married to Mr. Tackleton, why, you'd have slapped me, wouldn't you, May?" Though May didn't say yes, she certainly didn't say no, or express no, by any means. Tackleton laughed, quite shouted. He laughed so loud. John Peerybingle laughed too, in his ordinary good-natured and contented manner, but his was a mere whisper of a laugh compared to Tackleton's. "You couldn't help yourselves for all that," said Tackleton. "You couldn't resist us, you see. Here we are! Here we are! Where are your gay young bridegrooms now?" "Some of them are dead," said Dot, "and some of them forgotten. Some of them, if they could stand among us at this moment, would not believe that we are the same creatures, because they would not believe we could forget them. No, they would not believe one word of it." "Why, Dot!" exclaimed the carrier. "Little woman!" And Dot kept quiet, while Tackleton looked at her through his half-shut eye. May uttered no word, good or bad, but sat quite still, with her eyes downcast, and made no sign of interest in what had passed. Her mother, however, observed that girls were girls, and bygones were bygones, and that so long as young people were young and thoughtless, they would probably conduct themselves like young and thoughtless persons. She then remarked that she thanked Heaven that she had always found in May a dutiful and obedient child, for which she took no credit to herself, though she had every reason to believe it was owing to herself. With regard to Mr. Tackleton, she said that he was a son-in-law to be desired, as no one in their senses could doubt. Now, the meal ended, John Peerybingle rose to go, for he only stopped to feed his horse, and to enjoy the social hour before finishing his route. He would call for Dot on his way back. This was always the program on picnic days. "Goodbye," he said, pulling on his dreadnought coat. "I shall be back at the usual time. Goodbye, all." Then he called Boxer, and soon the old horse and the cart were making lively music down the road. Caleb and Bertha were talking together at one end of the room. "So bring me the precious baby, Tilly," said Dot, drawing a chair to the fire. "And while I have him in my lap, here's Mrs. Fielding, Tilly, who will tell me all about the management of babies, and straighten me out in 20 points where I am as wrong as can be. Won't you, Mrs. Fielding?" Here Tackleton walked out, and Mrs. Fielding, sitting bolt upright in front of Dot, gave her such a marvelous collection of receipts and rules that would, if Dot had carried them out, have utterly destroyed the young Peerybingle, even if he had been an infant Samson. Now Dot brought her needlework out of her pocket, and had a whispering chat with May while the old lady dozed, and after a while Caleb and Bertha joined them, and all found it a very short afternoon. Then, as it grew dark, since it was the solemn rule that Bertha should do no housework tasks On the days of the picnics, Dot trimmed the fire and swept the hearth, and set the tea tray out, and drew the curtains, and lighted a candle. Then she played an air or two on a rude kind of harp which Caleb had made for Bertha, and played them very well, for nature had made her delicate little ear as choice as one for music as it would have been for jewels, if she had had them to wear. By this time it was the usual hour for tea, and Tackleton came back again, to share the meal and spend the evening. When it was night, and tea was over, and Dot had nothing more to do after washing the cups and saucers, when the time drew near for the carrier's return, Dot began to grow nervous. Every time she heard the sound of distant wheels, her color came and went, and she was restless. Not as good wives are when listening for their husbands. No, no, it was a different sort of restlessness from that. Soon wheels were heard very near, horses' feet, the barking of a dog, and then the scratching of Boxer's paw. "Whose step is that?" cried Bertha, starting up. "Whose step?" said the carrier, standing in the door, his brown face ruddy as a winter's berry from the keen night air. "Why, mine." "The other step," Bertha said. "The man's tread behind you." "She's not to be deceived," observed the carrier, laughing. "Come on, sir. You'll be welcome, never fear." The shadow on the hearth. He spoke in a loud tone, and as he spoke, the deaf old gentleman entered. "He's not so much a stranger that you haven't seen him once, Caleb," said the carrier. "You'll give him house room till we go?" "Oh, surely, John, and take it as an honor." "He's the best company on earth to talk secrets in," said John. "I have reasonably good lungs, but he tried them, I'll tell you." Turning to the old gentleman, he spoke in a loud voice again. "Sit down, sir. All friends here, and glad to see you." Then he added in his natural tone, "A chair in the chimney corner, and leave to sit silent and look pleasantly about him is all he cares for. He's easily pleased." Bertha had been listening intently. She called Caleb to her side, and when he came, asked him, in a low voice, to describe their visitor. When he had done so, she moved away, and showed no further interest in him. The carrier was in high spirits, good fellow that he was, and fonder of his little wife than ever. "Some folks may think it queer," he said jokingly, putting his rough arm about her, as she stood apart from the others, "but I like the little lady somehow. Look yonder, Dot." He pointed to the old man. She looked down. I think she trembled. He is so fond of you that he talked of nothing else the whole way here. I like him for it." "I wish he had a better subject, John," she said, with an uneasy glance about the room, at Tackleton especially. "A better subject!" cried the jovial John. "There's no such thing. Come, off with the great coat, off with this thick shawl, off with the heavy wrappings, and now for a cozy half hour by the fire. How would it please you, Mrs. Fielding, to have a game of cards, you and I? All right? Where are the cards, Dot? And will you let us have a cup of tea here, if there's any left, small wife?" Soon the carrier and the old lady were deep within the game. At first the carrier looked about him sometimes with a smile, or now and then called Dot to peep over his shoulder to advise him on some knotty point. But soon he became so absorbed that he had neither eyes nor ears to spare, and his whole attention was upon the cards. He thought of nothing else, until a hand was laid upon his shoulder. "I am sorry to disturb you," said Tackleton in a low voice, "but I want a word with you, please." "It's my turn to deal," returned the carrier. "Can you wait?" "No," said Tackleton. "Come on, man." There was an expression in his pale face which made John rise immediately, and ask him in a hurry what the matter was. "Hush, John Peerybingle," said Tackleton. "I'm sorry for this, I am indeed. I have been afraid of it. I have suspected it from the first." "What is it?" asked the carrier in alarm. "Hush! I'll show you if you come with me." The carrier accompanied him without another word. They went across the yard, where the stars were shining, and by a little side door they entered Tackleton's own counting house. There, through a window, they could look into a window of the wareroom where the boxes of toys were kept. The counting house was closed for the night, and there was no light, but a dim light was burning in the wareroom, so they could easily see within. "Wait a moment," said Tackleton. "Can you bear to look through that window, do you think?" "Why not?" asked the carrier. "It will be a shock," said Tackleton. "Promise not to do anything violent." And then John looked, and what do you think he saw? He saw his dear young wife with the old man. Old no longer, but straight and handsome, holding in his hands his soft white hair with which he had made every one think him old and treat him so kindly. He saw her listening to him as he bent his head to whisper in her ear, and then let him place his arm about her waist and lead her slowly to the door. He saw her, with her own hands, adjust the wig on his head, laughing as she did so. John felt weak as an infant as Tackleton led him back to the house. He was wrapped up to the chin and busy with his horse and parcels when she came into the room, ready for going home. "Now, John dear, good night, May. Good night, Bertha," she said. How could she kiss them? How be so blithe and gay in her parting? Why didn't she blush? Tackleton as well as John wondered. Tilly was hushing the baby, and as she walked to and fro, she was repeating drowsily, "Did they thought that it was to be its wives, wring its heart almost to breaking, and did it weep all nights when nobody was there to see it?" "Now, Tilly, give me the baby," said little Mrs. Peerybingle. "Good night, Mr. Tackleton. Where's John, for goodness' sake?" "He's going to walk beside the horse's head," said Tackleton, who helped her into the cart. "My dear John! Walk? To-night?" The muffled figure of her husband made a hasty sign, and the stranger and nurse being by this time in their places, the old horse moved off, Boxer running on before, running back, running round and round the cart, and barking merrily. When Tackleton had gone off likewise, taking May and her mother, poor Caleb sat down by the fire beside his daughter. The toys that had been wound and set in motion for the baby had run down long ago. In the silence, one might have imagined that they had been stricken motionless with wonder at Dot being false, or Tackleton beloved under any set of circumstances. Presently Bertha spoke. "After Mr. Tackleton is married, we shall not see so much of him, shall we, father?" "Well, we might. That is to say," began Caleb. "How I should love to be like May, father, and have my eyes so that I might serve him, might show my love for him, who has been so good, so kind, so dear." Poor Caleb! How often he said to himself, as he looked at her in remorse, "Have I deceived her from her cradle, thinking to make her happier, but to break her heart at last?" End of section 37. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Section number 38 of the Mary Frances Story Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. The Mary Frances Story Book by Jane Eayre FRYER. Chirp the Third. John listens to the cricket. The Dutch clock in the corner struck 10, when the carrier sat down at his fireside. So troubled was he that he scarcely heard the cuckoo as it counted off the strokes. He could scarcely believe what his eyes had seen in the wareroom of Gruff and Tackleton. If any one had told him, he would not have believed his Dot could be a party to such dreadful deceit. Yet, in his own heart, he did not blame her, but rather the old young man who had been so wickedly unfair, and he was planning to do him harm to pay him back. He hoped that Dot would be able to explain, but no, there really wasn't any hope of that. There, she was coming. She had been upstairs with the baby, putting it to bed. As he sat brooding near the hearth, she came close to him, and put her little stool at his feet. He then felt her hand upon his own, and knew she was looking up in his face. He glanced at her. She looked as sweet as ever, until she caught the expression on his face. At first she seemed surprised, then her surprise changed in a wild recognition of his thoughts, and she simply bent her head and clasped her hands, but no words were said. At length she rose and went away, and he felt glad, for the first time since he had known her, to have her gone. There was a gun hanging on the wall. He took it down, and moved towards the stranger's room. He put his hand to the door, when suddenly the struggling fire burst into a glow of light, and the cricket on the hearth began to chirp. No sound he could have heard, no human voice, not even hers, could so have moved and softened him. The very words in which she had told him of her love for this same cricket were as if just spoken in her sweet, pleasant voice, making household music, and they thrilled through and through his better nature, and awoke it into life and action. He moved from the door like a man who had been walking in his sleep, when awakening from a frightful dream. He put the gun aside. Clasping his hands before his face, he sat down again beside the fire. The cricket on the hearth came out into the room and stood in fairy shape before him. "I love it," said the fairy voice, "for the many times I have heard it, and the many thoughts its harmless music has given me." "She said so!" cried the carrier. "True! This has been a happy home. John and I love the cricket for its sake. She's so sweet-tempered, so cheerful, busy, light-hearted. Otherwise I never could have loved her as I did." The voice correcting him said, "Do." "You should trust her," the fairy voice said. All night long he listened to the voice. All night long the household fairies were busy with him, showing him how sweet and dear she was, how he had never found her untrue, or had reason to doubt her except this once. He rose up when it was broad day, and washed and tidied himself. He could not go on his usual rounds, for it was Tackleton's wedding day. He had planned to go merrily to the church with Dot, but such plans were at an end. Ah, what a different wedding anniversary he had expected! John blames himself. The carrier had thought that Tackleton would pay him an early visit, and he was right. He had just finished brushing his hair when he saw the merchant in his carriage coming along the road. As the carriage drew nearer, He saw that Tackleton was dressed out sprucely for marriage, and that he had decorated his horse's head with flowers and favors. The horse looked much more like a bridegroom than Tackleton, whose half-closed eye was more disagreeably expressive than ever. But the carrier took little heed of this. His thoughts were elsewhere. "John Peerybingle," said Tackleton, "my good fellow, how do you find yourself this morning?" "I have had but a poor night, Mr. Tackleton," said the carrier, shaking his head, "for I have been a good deal disturbed in my mind. But it is over now. Can you spare me half an hour or so for some private talk?" "I come on purpose," returned Tackleton lightly. "Never mind the horse. He'll stand quiet enough if you'll give him a mouthful of hay." "You are not to be married before noon, I think," said John. "No," answered Tackleton. "Plenty of time, plenty of time." When they entered the kitchen, Tilly Slowboy was knocking at the stranger's door. One of her very red eyes was at the keyhole, for she had been crying because her mistress cried. She was knocking very loud, and seemed frightened. "If you please, I can't make nobody hear," said Tilly, looking round. "I hope nobody ain't gone and been and died, if you please." This hope Miss Slowbody made more emphatic by kicking on the door, but it led to no result. "Shall I help?" asked Tackleton, turning to John. The carrier nodded his head. So Tackleton went to the door, and he, too, kicked and knocked, and he, too, failed to get any reply. But he thought of trying the handle of the door, and, as it opened easily, he peeped in, went in, and soon came running out again. "He's gone," said Tackleton, "and the window's open. I don't see any marks, to be sure, or signs of a fight. But I thought perhaps you might have been so angry—" He nearly shut up the expressive eye altogether, he looked at John so hard, and he gave his eye, and his face, and his whole body a sharp twist, as if he would have screwed the truth out of John. "Make yourself easy," said the carrier. "He went into that room last night without harm in word or act from me, and no one has entered it since. He has gone away of his own free will." "Oh, well, I think he has got off pretty easy," said Tackleton, taking a chair. The sneer was lost upon the carrier, who sat down too, and shaded his face in his hand for some time before speaking. "You showed me last night," he said at length, "my wife, my dear wife that I love, deceiving me, and meeting a strange man who had deceived me. I think there's no man in the world I wouldn't rather have had show it to me." "I confess I know that I am not a favorite in your home, John, because I never believed wholly in your pretty little wife," said Tackleton. "And as you did show me, and as you saw her to such disadvantage, it is right you should know what my mind is on the subject, for it is settled, and nothing can change it." Tackleton muttered a few words about it being necessary to decide, but he was overawed by the manner of his companion. Plain and unpolished as it was, there was something noble and dignified about it. "I am a plain, rough man," continued the carrier, "with very little to recommend me. I am not a clever man, as you very well know. I am not a young man. I loved my little Dot, because I had seen her grow up from a child, in her father's house, because I knew how precious she was, because she had been in my life for years and years." He paused a moment, then went on. "I often thought that though I wasn't good enough for her, I should make her a kind husband, and perhaps appreciate her better than another, and so it came about we were married." "Ha!" said Tackleton, with a shake of his head. "I knew how much I loved her, and how happy I should be," continued the carrier, "but I had not sufficiently considered her." "No," said Tackleton. "No, you didn't stop to think how giddy, frivolous, fickle, vain. Ha!" "You'd better not interrupt me," said the carrier, with some sternness, "till you understand me, which you seem far from doing." The toy merchant looked at him in surprise. "I didn't consider that I took her, at her age, with her beauty, away from her young companions and their many scenes of pleasure, into my dull house and my tedious society. I didn't consider how little suited I was to her fun and humor, and how wearisome I must be to one of her quick spirit. No, I took advantage of her hopeful nature, and I married her. I shouldn't have done so." The toy merchant gazed at him without winking. Even the half-shut eye was now open. "Heaven bless her!" said the carrier. "For the cheerful way she has tried not to let me see how it was. Heaven help me, that, in my slow mind, I have not found it out before. Poor child! Poor Dot! Strange I did not realize when I have seen her eyes fill with tears on hearing of such a marriage as our own spoken of, how good and kind she has been. The thought will comfort me when I am here alone." "Here alone?" said Tackleton. "Then you do mean to take some notice of her deceit?" "I mean," answered the carrier, "to do her the greatest kindness in my power, to try to make it all up to her. She shall be free to go where she will." "Make it up to her!" exclaimed Tackleton, twisting and turning his great ears with his hands. "I must have heard wrong. You didn't say that, of course." "Didn't I speak plainly?" said the carrier, giving the toy merchant a shake. "Very plainly indeed," answered Tackleton. "As if I meant it?" "Very much as if you meant it." "Anger and distrust have left me," said the carrier, "and nothing but my grief remains. In an unhappy moment some old lover, better suited to her years than I, returned. Last night she saw him in the interview we witnessed. It was wrong. But otherwise than this, she is innocent if there is truth on earth. I should not have taken her from her home. She shall return to it, and I will trouble her no more. Her father and mother will be here to-day, and they shall take her home. This is the end of what you showed me. Now it's over." "Oh, no, John, not over. Do not say it's over yet. Not quite yet. I heard your noble words. I could not steal out again, letting you think me ignorant of what you said. Do not say it's over, till the clock has struck again." Dot had entered quietly while John and Tackleton were talking, and had heard every word. "No hand can make the clock which will strike again for me the hours that are gone," replied the carrier with a faint smile. "But let it be so, if you will, my dear." "Well!" muttered Tackleton, "I must be off, for when it strikes again, I must be on my way to church. Good-bye, John Peerybingle." The carrier saw him to the door, watched his horse until it disappeared in the distance, and then went out himself. His little wife, being left alone, sobbed piteously, but often dried her tears to say how good and dear he was. And once or twice she laughed through her tears so heartily and triumphantly that Tilly was quite horrified. "Ow, if you please don't," said Tilly. "It's enough to dead and bury the baby, so it is, if you please." "Will you bring him to see me sometimes," inquired her mistress, "when I don't live here, and have gone to my old home?" "Oh, if you please don't!" cried Tilly, throwing back her head. She looked a great deal like Boxer when he howled. "Ow! If you please, don't! What has everybody gone and been and done with everybody, making everybody so miserable? Ow!" Caleb confesses his deceit. And she might have kept on, if just at that moment Caleb Plummer had not come in, leading his daughter. "Why, Mary," which was Dot's other name, you remember. "Why, Mary," said Bertha, "not at the wedding?" "I told her you would not be there, Mum," whispered Caleb. "I heard as much last night. But bless you," said the little man, "I don't care what they say. I don't believe them. There ain't much of me, but what little there is would be torn to pieces sooner than I'd believe a word against you." He put his arms around her neck and hugged her very much as a child might have hugged one of the dolls he had made. "Bertha wanted to come see you instead of going to the wedding," said Caleb, "so we started in good time. I often wish I had not deceived her in regard to Tackleton, and I've come to the conclusion that I'd better tell her the truth. You'll stay with us while I tell her, won't you, Mum?" he inquired, trembling from head to foot. "I don't know what effect it may have upon her. I don't know what she'll think of me. I don't know that she'll ever care for her father afterwards. But it's best she be undeceived, and I must bear the consequences as I deserve." "Mary," said Bertha, "where is your hand? I heard them speaking softly last night of some blame against you. They were wrong. I told them so. I scorn to hear a word. I know and trust you, Mary, so well that could my sight be restored at this instant, I could choose you from a crowd. My sister!" Her father went on one side of her, while Dot remained on the other, holding her hand. "Bertha, my dear," said Caleb, "I have something on my mind I wish to tell you while we three are alone. Listen kindly. I have a confession to make to you." "A confession, father?" "Yes, my child. I have wandered from the truth," said Caleb, with a pitiable expression in his face. "I have wandered from the truth, intending to be kind to you, and have been cruel." She turned toward him, and repeated the word cruel. "He accuses himself too strongly, Bertha," said Dot. "You'll say so presently. You'll be the first to tell him so." "He cruel to me!" cried Bertha, with an unbelieving smile. "Not meaning to be, my child," said Caleb, "but I have been, although I never knew it until yesterday. My dear blind daughter, forgive me. The world, dear heart, is not as you imagine it. It is not as I have represented it. The eyes you have trusted in have been false to you." She turned her wondering face towards him still, but drew back, and clung closer to her friend. "Your road in life was rough, my poor one," said Caleb, "and I meant to smooth it for you. I have pictured things to you as different from what they are. I have even changed the characters of some people to make you happier. I have surrounded you with fancies." "But living people are not fancies," she said, turning very pale. "You can't change them." "I have done so, Bertha," Caleb told her. "There is one person you know—" "Oh, father, why do you say I know?" she said. "I who am so miserably blind." She stretched out her hands as if to feel her way. "The marriage that takes place to-day," Caleb continued, "is with a stern, sword-grinding man. He has been a hard master to you and me, my dear, for many years. Ugly in his looks and in his nature. Cold and callous always. Unlike what I have painted him to you in everything, my child. In everything." "Oh, why?" cried the blind girl. "Why did you ever do this? Teach me to love a person who really never existed. It is like death." Her poor father hung his head and offered no reply in his penitence and sorrow. Suddenly the cricket on the hearth, unheard by all but her, began to chirp, not merrily, but so mournfully that her tears began to flow, and when the fairy spirit which had been near the carrier all night appeared behind her, pointing toward her father, she turned to Dot. "Mary," she said, "tell me what my home is like, what it is truly." "It is a poor place, Bertha, very poor and bare indeed. The house will scarcely keep out the wind and rain another winter. It is as roughly shielded from the weather, Bertha," Dot continued in a low voice, "as your poor father in a sackcloth coat." The blind girl, greatly agitated, rose and led the carrier's wife a little aside. "Those presents that I treasured so much, that came almost at my wish," she said, trembling. "Where did they come from? Did you send them?" "No." "Who then?" Dot saw she knew already, and was silent. The blind girl spread her hands before her face again, but in quite a different manner now. "Dear Mary, a moment, please. Speak softly. Tell me truly. Look across the room to where we were sitting just now, to where my father is, my father, so kind and loving to me, and tell me what you see." "I see," said Dot, who understood her well, "an old man sitting in a chair, and leaning over sorrowfully with his head resting in his hands. He looks as if his child could comfort him, Bertha." "Yes, yes, she will. Go on." "He is an old man, worn with care and work. He is a sad, thoughtful, gray-haired man, who seems to have lost the object he most loved in the world, his child for whom he lived." The blind girl broke away from her, and dropping on her knees before him, threw her arms around his neck. "Oh, my father, my dear, dear father!" she cried. "I have been so blind! But now my eyes are open. I never knew you. To think I might have died and never known the father who has been so loving to me!" Caleb managed to say, "My Bertha!" "And in my blindness I believed him to be so different," said the girl, still caressing him. "So young and gay." "The fresh, smart father in the blue coat," said poor Caleb. "He's gone." "Nothing is gone," she answered. "Dearest father, no. Everything is here, in you. But father—" she hesitated. "Mary, Mary is just what you told me. There is no change in her. You never told me anything of her that was not true?" "I should have done so, I'm afraid," said Caleb, "if I could have made her better than she was. But I must have changed her for the worse, if I had changed her at all. Nothing could improve her, Bertha." The blind girl was delighted with this reply, even though she had felt so sure of what it must be, and her renewed embrace of Dot was charming to behold. The Dead Returns to Life. Dot glanced at the clock, and saw that it was within a few minutes of striking, and immediately became very excited. "More changes than you think for may happen, though," said Dot. "Changes for the better, I mean, changes for great joy to some of us. You mustn't let them startle you too much when they come. But listen! You've a quick ear, Bertha. Do you hear wheels upon the road?" "Yes, coming very fast." I know you have a quick ear," said Dot, holding her hand to her heart and talking as fast as she could, "because I have often noticed it, and because you were so quick to hear that strange step last night. though why you should have taken such a quick notice of it, and said, 'Whose step is that?' seems strange. But, as I said just now, there are great changes in this world, great changes, and we can't do better than prepare ourselves to be surprised at hardly anything." Caleb wondered what she meant, for he saw that she was speaking to him as much as to his daughter. He saw with astonishment that she was fluttered and distressed, and could scarcely breathe, as she held to a chair to save herself from falling. "They are wheels indeed," she panted, "coming nearer, nearer, very close. And now you hear them stopping at the garden gate. And now you hear a step outside the door. The same step, Bertha, is it not? And now—" She uttered a cry of delight, and running up to Caleb, put her hands over his eyes, as a young man rushed into the room, and flinging his hat into the air, came sweeping down upon them. "Is it over?" cried Dot. "Yes." "Happily over?" "Yes." "Do you know the voice, dear Caleb? Did you ever hear one like it before?" cried Dot. "If my boy who went to South America had not died, if he were alive," said Caleb, trembling. "He is alive!" shrieked Dot, taking her hands from his eyes and clapping them in ecstasy. "Look at him! See, here he stands before you, healthy and strong. Your own dear son, your own dear living brother, Bertha." She turned to meet the sunburned sailor halfway, and let him kiss her heartily. Just at this moment the carrier entered. Upon seeing them thus, he started back. "Look, John!" cried Caleb. "Look here, my own son! Him that you fitted out, and sent away yourself. Him you always such a friend to." The carrier advanced to seize him by the hand, but stepped back as he noticed his resemblance to the deaf man in the cart. "Edward, was it you?" "Now tell him all!" cried Dot. "Tell him all, Edward, and don't spare me." "I was the man," said Edward. "And you stole, disguised, into the home of your old friend," the carrier said. "I would never have believed it of you. There was a true and frank boy once. How many years is it, Caleb, since we heard that he was dead, and had proved, we thought, he would never have done that? There was a generous friend of mine once, a friend, who was more a father than a friend. He never would have judged a man before he heard his case. You were he, so I am certain you will hear me now." The carrier, with a troubled glance at Dot, replied, "Well, that's but fair, I will. You must know, then, that when I left here, a boy, I was in love, and my love was returned. But the girl was very young, and couldn't quite make up her mind. Still I felt quite certain that she loved me as dearly as I loved her." "You did!" exclaimed the carrier. "Yes, and now I am sure she did. So all through the hardships and perils of my years away, I was constantly thinking of when I should come back to her. When I landed, 20 miles from here, I heard she had bestowed herself upon another and a richer man. I did not wish to find fault with her if she had preferred him. What I wanted to find out was whether she had done this of her own free will. I wanted to judge for myself just how she felt, so I disguised myself, you know how, and waited on the road, you know where. You had no suspicion of me, neither had she," pointing to Dot, "until I whispered in her ear at the fireside, and so startled her that she nearly betrayed me." "Oh, Dot!" exclaimed the carrier. "But when she knew that Edward was alive, and had come back," sobbed Dot, now speaking for herself, as she had long wished to do. And when he told her why he had disguised himself, she advised him to keep his secret close, by all means, for she knew that his old friend John Peerybingle was too open in nature to keep such a secret, no matter how he tried. Then she, that's me, John, told him all, how his sweetheart had thought him dead, and how she had, after all the years, been over persuaded by her mother because the silly dear old thing called the marriage advantageous, and when she, that's me, John, told him they were not yet married, but soon would be, and that it would be nothing but a sacrifice if it went on, for there was no love on her side, and when he went nearly wild with joy to hear it, when she, that's me again, John, said she would help him and carry messages to his sweetheart, as she had so often done as a girl, and she would find out what his sweetheart thought was right. "Oh!" said John. "And it was right, John," Dot continued, catching her breath, "for they were married, John, an hour ago, and here's the bride. And Gruff and Tackleton may die a bachelor, and I'm a happy little woman. May God bless you!" As she drew May forward and lavished all kinds of good wishes and congratulations upon her, the carrier stood confounded. As he flew towards her, Dot stretched out her hand to stop him. "John, dear John, forgive me. It was wrong to have a secret from you. I am very sorry. I didn't think it any harm until the night when I came and sat down by you on the little stool. But when I looked at your face, I knew you must have seen me walking in the wareroom with Edward, and were suspicious of me. But oh, John, how could you think wrong of me?" John Peerybingle would have caught her in his arms, but no, she wouldn't let him. "Wait a minute, please, John dear, until you let me hear you tell me that you believe me, and trust me, and that you know how much I love you, so much that I'll never have another secret from you, and that you'll never, never think of sending me from my home and yours, John, and our cricket on the hearth." Then you would have been delighted to see Dot run into the carrier's arms. You may be sure the carrier was in a state of perfect rapture, and you may be sure that everybody, especially Miss Slowboy, wept for joy, and she, wishing to include the baby, handed him around to everyone in succession, as if he were something to eat or drink. But now the sound of wheels was heard again outside the door, and somebody exclaimed that Gruff and Tackleton was coming back in. Soon he appeared, looking warm and flustered. "My, what in nation's this, John Peerybingle?" said Tackleton. "There's some mistake. I had an appointment with Miss Fielding to meet me at the church, and oh, here she is!" seeing her with Edward, to whom he then turned, saying, "I beg your pardon, sir. I haven't the pleasure of knowing you, but if you can do me the favor to spare this young lady, she has a rather particular engagement with me this morning." "But I can't spare her," said Edward. "I couldn't think of it." "What do you mean, you vagabond?" exclaimed Tackleton. "I mean, and pardon you for being vexed, I mean that I am as deaf as your harsh words as I was last night." Such a startled look as Tackleton gave him. "It is too bad, sir," said Edward, holding out May's left hand, especially the third finger, "that the young lady can't accompany you to the church. But as she has been there once this morning, perhaps you'll excuse her." Tackleton looked hard at the third finger, and took a ring out of his waistcoat pocket. "Miss Slowboy," said Tackleton, "will you have the kindness to throw that into the fire? Thank you." "It was a previous engagement, quite an old engagement, that prevented my wife from keeping her appointment with you, I assure you," said Edward. "Mr. Tackleton will do me the justice to say that I told him about this old engagement many times, and that I never could forget it," said May, blushing. "Oh, certainly," said Tackleton. "Oh, to be sure. Oh, it's all right. It's quite correct. You are now Mrs. Edward Plummer, I infer." "That's the name," said the bridegroom. "Ah, I shouldn't have known you," said Tackleton. "I give you joy, sir." With these words he hurried away, merely stopping at the gate to take the flowers and favors off the horse's head, and to kick the horse once more, just to relieve his feelings. Of course, the next thing in order was the wedding feast, and Dot set to work with all her might, even calling in some neighborly help, and everybody, as if on the point of life or death, ran against each other in all the doorways, and round all the corners, tumbling over Tilly Slowboy and the baby everywhere. Then there was an expedition to find Mrs. Fielding, and to apologize to her, and to bring her back, happy and forgiving. At first she would not listen at all, and wouldn't say anything but, "Now carry me to my grave," which seemed absurd on account of her not being dead or even ill. After a while she settled down into a dreadful calm, and advantage was taken of this to get her into her coat and gloves, and carry her off to John Peerybingle's. When they reached the house, there was Dot's father and mother, and May's mother and Dot's mother began to renew their acquaintance. After a grand confusion of talk and action, they actually were seated at the table. To have missed that dinner would have been to have missed as good and as jolly a meal as man need eat. After dinner, Caleb sang his song about the sparkling bowl, and you may not believe it, but he sang it through. And by the by, a most unexpected thing occurred just as he finished the last verse. Tackleton does the unexpected. There was a tap at the door, and a man came staggering in with a big round box, which he set on the table in the center of the nuts and apples. He said, "Mr. Tackleton's compliments, and as he hasn't got no use for the cake himself, perhaps you'll eat it." And with those words he walked off. There was some surprise among the company, as you may imagine. Mrs. Fielding suggested that the cake might be poisoned, and told about a cake which she had heard of that had turned a seminary of young ladies blue. But notwithstanding the story, the cake was cut by May with much ceremony and rejoicing. I don't think anyone had tasted it, when there came another tap at the door, and the same man appeared again, having under his arm a big brown paper parcel. "Mr. Tackleton's compliments, and he's sent a few toys for the baby. They ain't ugly." The whole party would not have been able to find words to express their astonishment, even if they had had plenty of time, but they had none, for the messenger had scarcely shut the door when there came another tap, and Tackleton himself walked in. "Mrs. Peerybingle," said the toy merchant, hat in hand, "I'm sorry, I'm sour by disposition, but I am going to try to do better. Caleb, I might have had you and your daughter for dear friends. As it is, my house is lonely to-night. I have not even a cricket on the hearth. I have scared them all away. Be kind to me, please. Let me join this happy party." He was at home in 5 minutes. You never saw such a fellow. What had he been doing with himself all his life, never to have known before how much fun he had in him? Or what had the Fairies been doing with him to change him so? There was but one more living creature wanted to make the party complete, and in the twinkling of an eye there he was, very thirsty, with hard running. For Boxer had gone all the way with the cart on its journey, and being disgusted at finding his master absent, and unable to induce the horse to come with him, had turned tail and trotted home. There was a dance in the evening, but since the old people didn't dance, and Dot said her dancing days were over, because, I believe, she preferred to sit near the carrier really, Edward and May were the only dancers, and they got up amid great applause to dance alone, while Bertha played her liveliest tune. Well, if you'll believe me, they had not been dancing 5 minutes, when the carrier suddenly jumps up, takes Dot round the waist, dashes out into the room, and starts off with her, toe and heel, quite wonderfully. Tackleton no sooner sees this than he skims across to Mrs. Fielding, and follows suit. Then Dot's father and mother, and Caleb and Tilly Slowboy join in. Hark! How the cricket joins the music with its chirp, 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 and how the kettle hums. End of section 38. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Section 39 of the Mary Frances Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Dallman. The Mary Frances Storybook by Jane Eyre FRYER. The Return Home. Goodbye, Mary Frances. Come again. In the middle of the story, The Cricket on the Hearth, when everybody was so anxious to hear more, there came a sound of many voices, and then a loud scream. Mary Frances knew that it was the voice of the old witch who had been listening. "Let me be," she was crying. "I don't want to go away. I want to find out who the old man was. I want to find out who the old man was. I want to see if Tackleton did marry May Fielding. I won't go. So there! Did I tramp all the miles to get here just to be taken back again?" Then came the deep, heavy voice of the giant. "Be quiet," it said. "Be quiet. No, you won't have to go back. We'll take you. This time we'll lock you up so tight you'll stay where you're put, and you'll come when you're bid. That's what you'll do." "Somebody tell me quick!" screamed the old witch. "Quick! Did May Fielding marry Tackleton? Did she? Did she?" And Mary Frances heard her screaming, "Did she? Did she?" until her voice died away. How Mary Frances longed to tell her no, but she did not dare. "She deserves her punishment," the Queen whispered. And since she knew that this was true, Mary Frances did not speak. After the story was over, she received her copy from the Ready Writer and slipped it into her story satchel with the rest of the stories. Then she wandered down by the seashore alone. Near the shore there was a boy with a feather in his cap sitting on a rock. She knew him in a minute. "Where did the giant take the old witch, do you think, Peter Pan?" she asked. "To the Devil's Den," said Peter. "I saw them go." "To the Devil's Den!" cried Mary Frances. "How dreadful!" "It's not such a bad place," said Peter. "It's just a deep cave. It is lighted from a large opening in the top. Its name is the worst thing about it. But the old witch cannot get out of it if they lock her in." "Oh, she got away from the giant's basket, then?" "She did. She was so crazy to hear a story through that she watched her first chance to make off when the giant guard was asleep." "What about the pirate?" asked Mary Frances. "He is chained to a rock in the Pirate's Cove, and he spends his time jumping in and out of the water. He has jumped so much and so hard that the suds are rising all around him, just as when you blow bubbles in a bowl, holding the pipe down in the water, poor thing. Some day the suds will rise so high that the bubbles will cover him and smother him." "Is there no way for him to save himself?" asked Mary Frances. "Certainly," said Peter Pan. "All he has to do is be good. But he won't be. He's just naturally wicked. He'd murder fairies if he could, and he'd steal all the stories in the world, and he'd feed the children on charcoal and castor oil. He told me so once. It was after I caught him trying to steal my shadow." "He must have a wicked heart," said Mary Frances. "Once I asked him why he was so bad," Peter told her. "And what do you think he said?" "I don't know, I'm sure," she returned. "He said it was because his mother never kissed him." "His mother never kissed him?" exclaimed Mary Frances. "Why, what a queer kind of mother! Now my mother—" Suddenly she felt very homesick. Tears sprang to her eyes. "Why, Peter!" she cried wistfully. "Why, Peter! It must be over a year since my mother kissed me. Shall I turn wicked too? Oh, I wish I could see her, my own dear mother." As she finished speaking, a beautiful little sailboat appeared before them. It was smaller than the good fairy. "Step aboard then," said Peter Pan, rising and leading her toward the boat. "This is a ferry boat. You will be home in an hour. Sit in the stern, take the tiller in your hand, hold it steady, and wish out loud where you want to go." And he helped Mary Frances onto the boat. "Oh, but I haven't thanked the Story People for my wonderful, wonderful time!" she exclaimed. "I wish I could thank them." Even as she spoke, every door and window of the castle opened, and the Story People appeared. "Thank you all! Thank you forever and ever! Thank you for all the girls and boys in the world!" cried Mary Frances. "Have you your stories?" called the Story King. "Yes, I have them here," said Mary Frances, holding up her story satchel. "When you want more, come again, dear child," called the Story Queen. "Oh, yes, come again," called all the Story People, "for we love you. The Story People love all children. Take our love to all you can. And goodbye, goodbye, goodbye." "Goodbye, dear, dear friends," called Mary Frances as the little boat sailed away. "Goodbye and thank you." She watched until the island was too far away for her to make out the forms of the people at the castle windows. Then she wished aloud, "Home! Take me to my mother and father and my brother, little fairy sailboat." And the wind blew and filled the sails, and the sun warmed and cheered her, and the waves danced about the boat, making little lapping sounds which were like music. And the next thing she knew, she was running up the garden walk into her mother's open arms. "The stories are not yours, dear. They belong to all children," said her mother when Mary Frances emptied her story satchel and told her of her wonderful adventures among the Story People. "Let us make enough copies for them all." And so they wrote this book. End of section 39. End of the Mary Frances Storybook by Jane Eyre FRYER.